The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations is meeting today to hear testimony on no roadmap, no destination, no justification, the implementation and impacts of the reorganization of the Department of Interior. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record today if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. Hearing no objection, so ordered. One of the first things Ryan Sinky did after becoming secretary was try to implement a massive solution in search of a problem. The weakness in that approach to reorganizing the 70,000 employee Department of the Interior became clear early in the process. We have not seen data to show that there is a problem. We have not seen data to prove that a reorganization was the way to solve the problem. Nor have we seen a cost-benefit analysis or workforce planning data. No measurable goals, no comprehensive plan, and that's worth repeating. A massive reorganization, and we have seen no plan. The department has provided no monitoring plan to know if the reorganization is achieving its goals. We've not seen a timeline. In 2018, the Government Accountability Office laid out what agencies need to do if they want their reorganizations to be successful. Unsurprisingly, the recommendations include all the basic considerations that I mentioned, which have not been provided by Secretaries Bernhardt or Sinky. Before being elected to Congress last year, I owned a couple businesses and a community development organization. And as a businessman, I can tell you that with confidence, if I tried to tell company investors or shareholders that I was going to reorganize the company without showing them evidence of a need to do so or a way to measure that success, a plan, I'd be laughed out of the room. And yet, that is precisely the case at the Department of Interior. The actions that have been taken so far in the name of the reorganization have already had significant impacts. Starting in 2017, dozens of the most experienced, the most effective employees were moved out of their positions into positions for which they had no qualifications or interest and with very little notice. Most felt the moves were punitive or based on political ideology. The Office of the Inspector General was not able to determine whether the law was broken because documentation was so shoddy. These moves have lowered morale, created a culture of fear, and forced people and institutional knowledge out of the agency. And this was perhaps not an accident. About $60 million of funding has been diverted for the reorganization at a time of major proposed cuts to the agencies. And that kind of money could funnel critical infrastructure projects for people in the Central Valley of California who desperately need clean drinking water. It could have helped a number of national parks address their maintenance backlogs. It could have helped fund more than enough people to help Interior get rid of its FOIA backlog to allow the American people to know what their agency is doing. To try to uphold our constitutional prerogative to provide oversight on this major undertaking, this committee has repeatedly sought information from Interior. We have been repeatedly denied. And most recently, we tried to make it as easy as possible for them. In March 2017, President Trump issued Executive Order 13781, directing the heads of each executive agency to submit to the Office of Management and Budget a reorganization plan within 180 days. On April 10th, Chairman Overhaul and I sent an official documents request to Interior asking for that plan. Not all correspondence, not all records, not even 2 documents, just one single document. We know it exists. We have the email that says it is ready for final delivery. We even gave Interior the file name of the document so they didn't have to spend time looking for it. It's Agency Reform Plan, final 9/12/17.pdf. I'm not sure how much easier or quicker we could have made it, but we still don't have it. If Secretary Bernhardt wants to implement the Sinky or reorganization plans, he needs to start by providing Congress with a complete justification and a plan. He needs to work with Congress, this subcommittee, the American people, and Interior employees instead of seeing us obstacles to overcome. A reorganization can do a lot for an agency if it's done right. Let's work together to make sure it is. And with that, I now recognize Ranking Member Gohmert for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Cox, for holding this hearing, and that for two reasons. First, because transforming the Department of Interior is an important topic that does deserve additional congressional scrutiny. Second, because this hearing falls completely within the jurisdiction of this committee, which I hope will continue through the 116th Congress. The reorganization of the Department of Interior is just a small part in a larger effort of this administration to overhaul the entire federal government to make it more efficient and effective. In fact, in the Department of Interior, as Chairman alluded to, there is a tremendous backlog of $10 billion or more in simple maintenance, repair with what property the Department of Interior has. Yet, in recent years, the trend has been to acquire more and more property without even bothering to repair and maintain the property it has. I welcome the reorganization. I think it's over time that's past time that such should have been done. And it is consistent with the directive in March 2017, President Donald Trump issued Executive Order 13781, directing the head of each agency to submit reorganization plans in order to improve the efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability of that agency. In response to this executive order, former Secretary Ryan Sinky, when he was not having to answer claims against him that kept him busy and cost him tremendous amount of individual money, he began undertaking bold reforms, modernizing the way the Department of Interior operates. I'm confident the newly confirmed Secretary, David Bernhardt, will be able to continue and complete the historic reorganization of the department. Ultimately, this reorganization will result in reduced bureaucratic redundancy, increased federal accountability, improved coordination between the federal government, state agencies, and local governments while spending less money. I, too, look forward to seeing the reorganization plan. The Department of Interior has already made headway on this reorganization by transforming the past management structure of the department, which consisted of 8 bureaus, 49 regions, each operating in a unique patchwork of boundaries, into 12 unified regional boundaries based on watersheds and ecosystems. This approach will allow the department to move away from the one-size-fits-all solutions and focus resources on better serving their new regional boundaries. These new management plans will decrease redundancy while making coordination between different land management agencies more efficient. Moving the decision makers of the department closer to the field will add increased level accountability not available within the current model of concentrating bureaucracy in D.C. Many decision makers within the Department of Interior are located thousands of miles away from the land and people that their decision will affect. For example, the Bureau of Land Management oversees nearly 385,000 miles of public lands. 99% of this land is in western states and Alaska. Why should these lands continue to be managed by decision makers inside this beltway? While several details of the reorganization plan remain unconfirmed, I am afraid based on the title of today's hearing, majority merely intends to spend time criticizing tearing down the plan. Instead, I hope we don't miss the opportunity to truly explore how the Department of Interior can evolve to better serve the American people, participate in a fruitful discussion. Historically, agency reorganizations have not been a partisan issue. Many different agencies and bureaus have attempted reorganization plans throughout this nation's history by both Republican and Democratic administration. There's much that could be done to transform the Department of Interior to better address the challenges it'll face in the 21st century, and I'm glad we're holding the hearing today to explore those options. And I look forward to hearing the testimony today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Mr. Scott Cameron is the Principal Deputy Secretary for Policy, Management, and Budget at the Department of Interior. Mr. Michael Bromwich is the founder and managing principal of the Bromwich Group. After the Deepwater Horizon spill, Mr. Bromwich spent 18 months at the Department of Interior leading the reorganization of the Minerals Management Service. Ms. Jamie Rappaport Clark is the President and CEO of Defenders of Wildlife. From 1997 to 2001, she was the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Mr. Harold Fraser is chairman of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe based in South Dakota. Chairman Fraser also serves as president of the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association. Under committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there's 1 minute left, and then red when time is expired. After witnesses have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. And with that, the chair now recognizes Mr. Scott Cameron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Gohmert. I'm delighted to be with you this morning to discuss the Department of the Interior's reorganization effort. I do have a few opening remarks, and I appreciate that my full written statement will be submitted for the record, so thank you for that. The Department's reorganization is in response to President Trump's 2017 executive order to reorganize the executive branch to better meet the needs of the American people in the 21st century. Our agency's reform plan highlights the need to modernize and plan for the next 100 years of land and water resource management. The first and very significant step we took toward reorganization was to create 12 unified regions that align most of our bureaus within shared geographic boundaries and, more importantly, shared geographic perspectives. After much input from the department's career senior executive staff, Congress, governors, and external stakeholders, including consultations with Indian tribal leaders, the map was finalized and the unified regions took effect on August 22, 2018. Importantly, these new unified regional boundaries replaced a confusing array of 49 separate but overlapping regional boundaries among our 9 bureaus and offices. Reorganization makes it easier for the public and our partners to do business with us by first reducing the confusion that the many different bureau boundaries caused. The new structure enables improved coordination among federal, state, local agencies and provides a structure for delegating more decision-making authority to regions to better serve the needs of our customers and partners, especially on matters affecting multiple bureaus. We will also create more opportunities for employee career advancement and movement across bureaus by promoting cross-bureau collaborative work within each region. We will improve efficiency by sharing resources for common administrative services such as information technology, human resources, and procurement. Indeed, we're in the process of receiving and analyzing 3 independent contracts to evaluate those management functions of the department. After the unified regions were established, we asked current Bureau career executive leaders in the 12 regions to form regional executive committees and to select one of their peers as a regional facilitator. The regional facilitator temporarily serves as a central point of contact in each of the unified regions. The members of the 12 regional executive committees are responsible for sharing information and exploring how to work with each other more closely on programmatic and administrative support teams within their unified regions. We have also proposed moving elements of the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Geological Survey's headquarters operations west to bring them closer to the public that they interact with most frequently. As a result of the reorganization, the department is better positioned to accomplish our mission and serve the needs of your constituents. Our staff will be able to do their jobs better as we increase our ability to share knowledge and resources across our bureaus. We will reduce risks to the organization and the confusion that is introduced through inconsistent policies for things like cybersecurity, acquisition, and human resource management. We are proceeding deliberately and intentionally on all aspects of reorganization. We will develop new performance measures to evaluate our success and return on investment. We will consider results over time and on a regional basis to determine our success and to identify areas where we still need to improve. The key here is flexibility. We are looking for an approach that will allow us to fine-tune our management strategies from region to region, reflecting the local needs of the people we serve in the region. I look forward to answering your questions and to working with the committee to implement the department's vision for the reorganization and modernization. And thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Clark. The chair now recognizes Chairman Harold Fraser.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm honored to be here today, and I thank you for allowing me the time to address you and your committee. You know, when this reorganization happened, us tribes in the Great Plains area, and I'm sure throughout the United States, we were never properly consulted. When they come to the region, Great Plains region, we were given a picture of a map. That's all we were given. We weren't given any plans of the purpose of and how or why this change is needed or how it's going to benefit our people. It was never done. That's all we were given. I've been in office going on my 16th or my 4th term, and one of the things I've learned is that every reorganization on behalf of Indian people has never worked. I'll give you an example. The Bureau of Indian Education, you know, they restructured, they created a new agency, but one of the things they didn't do is take all the functions from the BIA or transfer any of them. And what that caused is a lot of no personnel at our schools. Right now on Cheyenne High School, we haven't had a math teacher in 5 years. I went to a meeting several weeks back, and I was told that in this fall of 2018, the BIE was only filled at 23% of positions, and today they're at 43%. So we question that. Where is that money? If they were allocated 100% for salaries, where is that money? Is that money going to go to fund this reorganization? Is this money, coming off the children, the backs of our children, their future, that's going to pay for this reorganization that will never benefit Indian people or will never work? You know, we are always left behind as Indian people. We are not rocks, we are not trees, we are human beings. We live and breathe just as every American in this country. If there is going to be a reorganization, one of the things that I think would work, it should come from the grassroots level up. Instead, many times it comes from Washington, comes down, and they have no idea, no clue of what's happening at the local level, and that's something that I think that has always failed. Today, we feel that we are being abandoned by the federal government. We have big issues of roads, no infrastructure, but yet the BIA or nobody's there to help us. I mean, we just got through some flooding that damaged a lot of our roads on our reservation. And one morning, I got a call that we had to shut another road down. And I could not think of anybody to call because everybody that I've talked to have never come through for us. So we truly feel that we are abandoned today. And, you know, we have treaties with the federal government. We are sovereigns. We need to be treated as such. Right now, we don't even know, we haven't had a permanent superintendent at our agency for the past 4 or 5 years. We rotate our area directors. So everything that's happening today is not working for our people. It's just a waste of time and money. I mean, if there's truly going to be reorganization, then we truly, as Indian people, need to be consulted. We need to be involved because that's our lives. Our people's lives are at stake. We need to know and dictate where our future is going to take us. A lot of times, we're just ignored. And like I mentioned earlier, when they come to Rapid City with this map, and it was my turn to talk, I walked by them and I faced the wall of the building and I talked to that wall because that's the way we are treated by the BIA and by the federal government. We have no voice. We have nothing. But yet, we were here first. You know, this is our country. This is our home. From the beginning of time, we've always lived in this country. And we'll never leave. We have nowhere else to go. So I thank you for allowing me the time, and thank you for allowing me to be here. So thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Fraser. The chair now recognizes Mr. Michael Bromwich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Gohmert. I served in the federal government for a total of 14 years. Most recently, I served as the country's top offshore drilling regulator in the Department of the Interior from June 2010 through late 2011. My testimony will focus on the first principles that should guide a significant government reorganization and how they were applied to the reorganization we undertook at Interior following the oil spill. First, a bit of background. In late April 2010, the Deepwater Horizon rig was conducting exploratory drilling in the Macondo well in the Gulf of Mexico. The rig experienced a violent blowout that killed 11 people and injured many others. It was a human tragedy of major proportions, but also an enormous environmental tragedy. In early June 2010, I was asked by President Obama to lead the agency responsible for the oversight of offshore drilling, at the time known as the Minerals Management Service, or MMS. We took immediate steps to modify the rules governing offshore drilling, but we also looked at whether the government's organizational structure for managing it was the right fit for the risks that it posed. We ultimately concluded that it was not, but not before we developed a detailed understanding of the way the agency operated and the costs and benefits of changing that structure. The agency was responsible for three very different missions: collecting royalties and revenues for the offshore program, making balanced resource decisions, and developing and enforcing regulations governing offshore activities. These three missions conflicted with each other, and the history of the agency demonstrated that revenue collection was emphasized at the expense of the other missions. By the time I arrived at DOI 6 weeks after the initial explosion, discussions had already begun about reorganizing MMS to eliminate its structural conflicts, but I was given the discretion to decide whether or not to do it. I don't take reorganizations lightly. I have a bias against them. They are disruptive, expensive, frustrating, and they tend to depress morale. They create uncertainty and divert resources. They frequently fail to achieve their objectives. Reorganizations are too often undertaken for reasons of executive vanity. They are developed and implemented in haste, inadequately vetted, based on inadequate analysis, and insufficient consultations with stakeholders, including the personnel responsible for implementing them. They are a way for a new executive or executive team to put their imprint on an organization, whether the changes make any sense or not. Those are bad reasons for undertaking a reorganization, but those are the reasons that many are undertaken. In the case of MMS, we became convinced that a reorganization was necessary and appropriate, but only after careful study and consideration of less disruptive alternatives. I want to emphasize that when we began the process, there was no preordained outcome. We did not decide on the reorganization that was ultimately implemented and then work backwards to justify it. Instead, we undertook a detailed process together with outside consultants who were experts in organizational diagnosis and reorganizations. We considered a number of less sweeping changes, including changes to staffing levels, enhanced training, and other organizational tweaks. In the end, our analysis and discussions pointed to a broad reorganization, and my prepared statement goes into detail into the various steps we took during the process. Throughout the process, we were extraordinarily open about what we were doing. We were open with the agency's personnel, with DOI, with the Congress, and with the public. We spoke frequently about what we were doing and why we were doing it. The broad contours and most of the specifics of the reorganization were embraced by members of Congress of both parties. In the more than 7 years since the reorganization was completed, its wisdom has been demonstrated. I've just told in very abbreviated form the story of a rare species, a successful government reorganization. As I said at the outset, I know very few of the details of the proposed and far broader DOI organization that is the subject of this hearing, but I gather I'm not alone, because the details of the reorganization have not been shared widely with agency personnel, the Congress, or the public, including local stakeholders, communities, and Native American tribes. That's a problem. I'm aware of no internal or external studies of any kind that have made the affirmative case for the proposed DOI reorganization. I am aware of no analyses or studies that have presented the anticipated benefits of the reorganization and balanced them against anticipated costs. A number of questions should be asked about the proposed reorganizations, questions that I have detailed in my prepared statement. Without addressing those issues, it's hard for me to see how DOI gets the internal and external buy-in necessary to achieve long-term benefits from the proposed reorganization. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ramich. And the chair now recognizes Ms. Jamie Rappaport Clark.
Thank you, Chairman Cox, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Gohmert, for inviting me to testify on this important topic. With more than 20 years of service with the federal government, I have personal experience with reorganization initiatives and with leading mission-driven organizations. I believe the administration's current effort to reorganize Department of the Interior distracts from its vitally important mission, wastes scarce fiscal and human resources, disrupts the essential and lawful functions of interior bureaus, reduces staff capacity, and seriously undermines employee morale. To succeed, there must be clarity not only on the problems posed by the existing structure, but how the proposal will measurably improve performance. Impacts to personnel and operations must be explicitly considered. Transparency and public engagement across all affected sectors is vitally important. The administration has not satisfied these fundamental criteria. Their plan suffers from a lack of crucial details, transparency, accountability, and public engagement. They have never really described a compelling need for reorganization. Consideration of critical questions about the scope, purpose, impacts, benefits, and risks of such a radical transformation have not been reconciled. In the absence of clear and compelling information, many critical questions still remain. Will the department involve the public, Congress, and stakeholders in its reorganization efforts? As the department directs staff and resources away from mission-critical activities, it's doing so without seeking legitimate input from affected constituencies. Will reorganization undermine the authority and missions of interior bureaus, agencies, and officials? A unified military command is fundamentally inappropriate for coordinating interior bureaus. A distinct mission and responsibilities for each bureau are established by law. Those missions sometimes align, but sometimes diverge or even conflict, and that's by design. Certainly, bureaus can and should coordinate their actions better to achieve timely outcomes, but they cannot be legally subordinated to the control of a single unified regional directorship. The administration's proposal of 12 unified regions cut through watersheds, they cut through states, and even individual public lands units, confounding management and complicating relationships with partners. Overlaying new regions atop current agency boundaries will fracture relationships developed with stakeholders over many years. Although Interior touts the new regional overlay as a reduction in the total number of regions, it will actually require additional bureaucratic structure. It requires the creation of a new regional office and staff structures, for some bureaus by as much as 50%. Is reorganization a vehicle to deliver the administration's controversial policy agenda? Given this administration's agenda of energy dominance on the public domain and continuous attacks on our conservation laws and regulations, it's fair to question whether their purpose is to support their policy priorities and weaken the effectiveness of conservation programs rather than to achieve objectives of efficiency and public service in carrying out the Interior Department's complex and multidimensional mission. Will reorganization displace or reduce staff or distract department employees from their mission-critical duties? The department's talented and dedicated career employees are their greatest asset. Supporting and investing in them is key to their mission success. Interior has not only rejected this principle, its actions repeatedly indicate a belief that public employees are liabilities, unnecessary bureaucracy, rather than essential to the department's important mission and their success. Will reorganization siphon critical resources needed to fulfill essential responsibilities for natural resources management and protection? At a time of shrinking appropriations for conservation, for science, for recreation, and other vital management programs at Interior, it's irresponsible to invest scarce resources into a process that will likely fail to improve government performance and provide a fair return to taxpayers. The Department of the Interior does not need reorganizing. It needs leadership. After more than 2 years in office, they should focus instead on filling vacant, high-level positions, including the directors of the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, the Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks. with qualified professionals in addressing the critical conservation and resource management challenges we face today. We respectfully urge Congress to suspend this damaging effort. Pushing forward with this will be the detriment of the department, our natural resources, and the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your valuable testimony. The chair will now recognize members for questions, and under Committee Rule 3D, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. And with that, I'd like to recognize myself for the first 5 minutes. Mr. Cameron, Chairman Grijalva and I asked for a single document, the only single document I know exists that could resemble a comprehensive plan because the executive order required it. We haven't gotten it, and I know it was completed. It was prepared for delivery, and went to the trouble of locating it in your files for you just to make it as easy as possible, but somehow can't seem to find it and get it to this committee. Committee staff has asked you to prioritize it for this hearing over other requests. I can only conclude that some review process among political appointees is holding it up. What is the delay? Is one, I certainly hope you're not trying to, and I don't mean to say that you're hiding anything, but we've asked for this document. It has not been produced for this committee, for this Congress, for your public consumption.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. I'm aware of that specific request, and our Office of Congressional Relations is in the process of producing a response for the committee. I think it's worth pointing out that the document in question was actually a submission from Secretary Sinky to OMB, and as such, it didn't represent a final document in terms of representing the views of the White House.
So I'm going to take it that's a commitment to providing the committee with that document. And can you give us a date for that delivery?
Sir, I'm not in a position at this point to promise you that we're going to give you the document. I will promise you that we'll be responding to the letter, and I hope shortly.
Thank you. Chairman Fraser, is there any evidence at all, and I think you already testified to this remark, but I just want to hit the point again that this reorganization improves services to federally recognized tribes?
What was that?
Is there any evidence that you have seen so far that the reorganization will improve services to federally recognized tribes?
No, like I mentioned, all we were given was a map and no other details was given to us. I don't believe it's going to improve services to the tribe.
And Mr. Cameron, can you elaborate on that? And there seems to be just absolutely, from what the chairman is speaking to us about, just no coordination, no notification, no conversation.
Mr. Chairman, so I had an opportunity to have a conversation with the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs staff before I prepared for this hearing, and my understanding is that BIA held 11 formal tribal consultation meetings and an additional 7 listening sessions with tribal leaders around the country on the reorganization. Because we respect the sovereignty of Indian tribes, we were not willing to impose, if you will, the involvement of BIA and BIE in the reorganization effort on the tribes. And since the tribes have not been particularly enthusiastic about the notion of their bureaus being part of the reorganization, we in fact have not included them. I would suggest that to the extent there is improved coordination at a regional level with the other bureaus of the department, that would give Indian tribal leaders, one-stop shopping, if you will, one regional director to talk to, as opposed to being passed along from the Fish and Wildlife regional director to the USGS regional director to the Bureau of Reclamation regional director.
Chairman Fraser, any feedback with regard to that?
Yeah, the only time I recall them coming these past several years was to Rapid City, and like I mentioned, they only come one time with a map. I don't I never seen any documentation that there was other consultation hearings or anything like that. I don't, most of the time, what I seen is just the decision-making, because nobody's in a permanent position, they're all in an acting capacity, is a lot of our questions their decisions are never made. I mean, we gotta chase it and all the way up here to Washington sometimes.
There's the point there, is I'm sure you can see, Mr. Cameron, is that one of the key stakeholders just feels excluded from the process. Regardless of the hearings that you've had or the meetings that you've had, the point is not getting across to the people that we need to be talking to. So I certainly hope that the feedback from these meetings, the notes, agenda, are going to be made part of this plan and integrated with the plans moving forward. Out of time, so the chair will now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cameron, with regard to the title of the hearing today, are there no roadmaps, no destinations, and no justification for DOI reorganization?
Thank you, Mr. Gohmert, for that question. I would suggest that actually we do have all aspects of that. We've have essentially the reorganization has three parts: the unified region concept, which is already initially deployed, if you will. There's the notion of saving money to invest in Indian schools and other departmental services by pursuing shared services in our back office administrative functions to get some efficiencies there. And the third prong is the notion of moving the headquarters elements of BLM and the USGS west to be closer to where the preponderance of those bureaus' activities is taking place. And I'd add that there's a precedent for their Bureau of Reclamation is largely headquartered in Denver right now.
And I appreciate that, and I think it will be tremendously helpful when Chairman Fraser doesn't have to chase things to Washington. He can go much more locally to have his input considered. And even though apparently the 11 hearings and 7 additional listening sessions at tribal offices, gatherings, and other venues may have indicated a desire not to have reorganization, I'd submit that BI really does need some reorganization efforts. In fact, hearings that we've had in this committee since I've been here indicated that, for example, there was an attorney working for the Clinton administration that specifically chose to leave out a provision in a contract with oil companies for offshore drilling, which cost the federal government $10 billion and inured to the benefit of people like British Petroleum. And that attorney that left out that provision then went to work for British Petroleum. We tried to subpoena that attorney, and we're told, well, she doesn't work for the government, so we can't facilitate that. And then not long after that, I found out she had now come back to work for the Obama administration. We also know, apparently, Mr. Brumwich went to work for DOI a couple of months after the Deepwater Horizon blowout. Some of us recall that specifically. And we couldn't believe that DOI wasn't doing more to go after British Petroleum. And we found out in hearings here that they had nearly 800 egregious safety violations when Exxon or others had 1, 2 or so like that. How were they ever allowed to keep going? There were rumors of different bribes and things like that. And we were assured by the Obama BLM director and others that the organization at that point was addressing all those issues. And in fact, they were very careful to make sure inspectors of offshore drilling that was under DOI, that they sent 2 people out at a time to make sure that no bribes were going on, because one would surely report the other if that occurred. And shortly after, it was disclosed at the hearing that Actually, the two people that were sent out the last inspection of the Deepwater Horizon were our father and son. The BLM director didn't last long right after our hearing before being removed. So it appeared clear to me, regardless of what reports you have internally, from an external perspective, the DOI has been in as much need of reorganization of any group I have ever seen in my life. And from exposure to the Park Service, which seems to be more about the Park Service, same with Fish and Wildlife. There are too many people that work there that are more about themselves to the detriment of the public, not taking care of repairs. We heard mention of shrinking budgets, yet we know the Land and Water Conservation Fund keeps growing and it keeps being used to acquire property rather than keeping up with what we have. So I would submit, just based on what I've seen in the hearings over the years, we're deeply in need of reorganization. But with the chairman, I share a desire to see the final product as soon as we can get that so that we can do proper oversight. I would encourage you to make that available, Mr. Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gohmert. And now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rappaport-Clark, just a general question. I was thinking if there was an instruction manual on how to fundamentally weaken an agency, this is what I think it would recommend. Start by creating a crisis for key agencies, move them as far away from Congress as possible to minimize contact with appropriators and authorizers, undermine those relationships, separate them from the nonprofit community that helps them make informed decisions, then make it clear to the workforce that they are not valued. Create a culture of fear to demand total loyalty. Transfer them to jobs for which they have no qualifications or interest. Send them to new parts of the country. Uproot their families and lives. Quietly close or gut programs throughout the agency. Take away their decision-making authority and voice within the department, and put it in the hands of political appointees. Cut them out of the loop so they don't even know what is happening in the areas they cover. Downgrade their performance ratings across the board, claiming they could not possibly be good at their jobs. Ms. Rappaport-Clark, how do these attacks on workers, following this manual, which I think is going on, affect our ability to protect endangered species, address climate change, or for that matter, fulfill all the other legal mandates that DOI has?
They don't, Mr. Chairman. It is incredibly destabilized. Focus is not on the task at hand. Employees are confused. Stakeholders are confused. Communication is not flowing. And there's a culture of fear in the Interior Department, clearly in the Fish and Wildlife Service, given the reckless nature of senior executive reassignments with no justification, with no information, with no conversation. Another round is expected to be coming. This is an agency, I believe, in crisis, which diverts its talent, it diverts its responsibilities, it diverts its attention to addressing species extinction, land management needs, climate change, all of the water management, all of the very important natural resource values that department's trusted to oversee and take care of.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, Mr. Cameron, when you were here just a few weeks ago, I showed you this email chain which documents to all senators and myself were directed to be bottlenecked through two political appointees who were handling nominations. You had a chance to learn about that email. Could you explain to me why I was singled out? I don't have a role in the nomination of, I don't have a vote on the nomination of Bernhardt, didn't have a vote. And can you tell us the status, what information you have since we saw you last?
Mr. Chairman, I didn't know anything about that email chain back then when you first showed it to me, and I don't know anything more about it now. To the best of my knowledge, no member of the Congress has been singled out. We're trying to be very responsive. We produced tens of thousands of pages of documents over the last 2 years, sir. And
Mr. Cameron, you're a smart guy. Everybody knows that. You should have anticipated this question, and that raises questions about obstruction. Why was one person singled out? I would like a date, and why then am I singled out? The email was sent by career staff. Which political appointee directed career staff to send that email? And is the directive still in place? And when will it be rescinded? Those are questions that demand answers, and we have to have them as a committee, because not just for myself, but this can affect any member of this committee where they're singled out not to receive information. And I think that whether it's one individual or not, it's a precedent that I think needs to be dealt with. I repeat the same request we had the last time. I think it's vital information that we have, and when do you anticipate giving us that information?
Mr. Chairman, I can tell you that Secretary Bernhardt is very interested in having conversations with the Congress. I believe he has requested individual meetings with dozens of members of Congress in the process of trying to get those scheduled over the next several weeks. So we are actively interested in engaging with the Congress. I hope that you and the Secretary will have an opportunity to have a conversation.
Thank you.
That still doesn't answer the question. Yield back. Not at all.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for being here. I assume that you'll probably have to make sure that your testimony is in writing, since very few members of the committee are actually here to hear you. We actually had 25% of the committee in attendance when Mr. Gosar showed up. That percentage just jumped up to 37%. It's not a stellar performance by Congress by any means, but thank you all. I appreciate you doing that. Let me ask some questions. I've heard some of the comments that have come out from our witnesses calling reorganization disruptive, expensive, and frustrating, which is also the verb or adjectives that can be used for the status quo right now. It is disruptive, expensive, and frustrating, and much of the success of certain reorganizations, I think, have been inflated at some times. One of the witnesses said we had to chase this all the way up here to Washington, which is one of the problems we have with the Department of Interior right now, which is why the reorganization was established or presented in the first place. Department of Interior was established in 1848, and it came out of bringing programs from 3 different departments at that particular time. It was actually the 5th department that was established. And to say that it was done by design is really strange. It was done by happenstance. In fact, even the BLM today, its job and mission is totally different than the reason for which it was created in the 1930s. So what we do is really need to take a step back and try and look at things and say, how can we do something intelligent and rational in this particular approach? So let me ask a couple of specific questions about the topic matter at hand. Mr. Cameron, BIA, Bureau of Indian Education, and the Office of Special Trustee for American Indians, those are not part of any reorganization process that's being proposed, right?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. So with that, I can still understand why Chairman Fraser would be frustrated with BIE. To illustrate, I think it shows the kind of disruption that we have in that entire process here in Washington. We have jurisdiction over BIA as far as oversight is concerned, but not over BIE, which is in the Labor Committee. If you can figure out why that happens and why that worked out, that's another problem, a question I always had. I was very interested in Bureau of Indian Education issues, but they were not in the purview necessarily of our committee, but not legally because of that, simply by tradition, which is one of the problems that Interior has over the decades that have been there, is things have been developed by tradition without legally thinking through them. So Mr. Fraser, Chairman Fraser, I agree with what you're saying about the problems of BIE. I hope we can solve that, which is also one of the reasons I hope Mr. Grijalva will simply schedule a hearing for our backlog bill, because some of that money that goes from created in our Park maintenance backlog bill would also be extended in the House version to the Bureau of Indian Education. It's an important source of money to try and help change and reform that system. Mr. Cameron, let me also ask you, you talked about benefits in your written testimony of relocating a DOI from Washington, D.C. Can you just simply explain some of the long-term savings that a relocation would actually realize?
Yes, Mr. Bishop. So there are a number of types of savings. For one thing, the rental cost in most cities in the West is a lot cheaper than in the main interior building or in Washington, D.C. more generally. Travel costs, travel time. Most of the airplane trips are from the East Coast to the West Coast. If we had the Geological Survey headquarters and the BLM headquarters out west somewhere, there'd be a lot more one-hour plane trips instead of four-hour plane trips. Cost of living for our employees is a lot cheaper out west in most locations than it would be here. And there are a list of a dozen or so variables that we're looking at.
All right. Let's talk about something specific. If we actually did increase the effort on the local level to have better communications between all these different stovepiped agencies and divisions, can you tell me how that would possibly impact, let's say, like wildfire response, wildfire mitigation, if we could coordinate with the Forest Service?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Mr. Bishop.
I like that much better too, but that's
typically, for most significant issues, multiple bureaus are involved. And the traditional approach has been, if there are issues or conflicts between bureaus...
You got 25 seconds to say it. Tell me.
Okay, there'll be closer coordination, tighter coordination at the regional level, less decisions kicked up to Washington.
Look, if you guys have not been conversing or talking to people, because I remember the first map, which was done along county lines, now it's done along state lines. That came from conversations with the states. I wonder if you have not been communicating, why was Mr. Kaysen out there, Ms. Sloan was out in my particular area talking to people about it? We have had those conversations. I'm over. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, for 5 minutes.
Hello. Okay, got the right time. Secretary Cameron, what ways are the DOI's reorganization going to improve on-the-ground responses? I mean, I can give you a number of ones from Arizona that we're looking at. Fish and Wildlife Service reaction in regards to Lake Havasu, and I know Forest Service isn't part of it, but the RFP situation for large-scale landscape timber thinnings. Tell me how it's going to act on the ground, the reorganization.
So I can give you one good example that's relevant, especially, I think, to Arizona. I know that you and the chairman of the full committee are both concerned about water resource issues in Arizona. Well, the invasive salt cedar or tamarisk plant causes major problems in riparian areas in terms of depleting water supply. Well, it goes through BLM land, it goes through Fish and Wildlife Service land, it goes through park land, it goes through state and private land, it goes through Indian reservations. By increasing coordination at the regional level on a multi-bureau basis, we can make smarter decisions, we can allocate our resources more intelligently, and we can deliver better results for the American people. So that's just one example. Fire is another, forest management, water resource management in the Central Valley of California would be another.
I think the only drawback to your plan, though, was that we would, if we were part of California from Arizona, we'd ask that the headquarters be in Arizona so that California came to Arizona for that aspect. No pun intended. Now, how would the regional directors interact?
So the Bureau regional directors would continue to have their traditional chain of command to Washington. We would not be attempting to change any statutory delegations for any of the bureaus, contrary to what my former colleague at Interior felt a few minutes ago. But at the regional level, we would have an Interior regional director who would be a coordinator in chief, a convener in chief, to pull his or her peers together to deal with common issues. So that, again, there's more decision-making by career senior executives at the regional level, fewer issues kicked up to Washington. Washington. This has worked in California, for instance, where Paul Sousa, the regional director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, is coordinating the activities of the Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Geological Survey. It's great to have one person being able to convene all the bureaus with equities in an issue rather than kicking things up to Washington for decisions 3,000 miles away.
So give me an oversight about accountability. I mean, part of the problem that we've had in Arizona on a number of issues has been lack of accountability. Tell me how that response time is going to change. And what are the steps of accountability?
So by having, we will be working on individual performance standards for the person who is charged with being an Interior Regional Director in each one of the regions. And there will be specific expectations in terms of what that person's scope is or is not on a region-by-region basis. And they would be reporting to the Deputy Secretary in Washington. So we will have accountability, but we will be not cutting out the Bureau Directors and the Assistant Secretaries. The traditional chains of command will also apply.
So I'm going to be more specific. So we had this debacle in Lake Havasu where we had a regional director overstep his direction. Totally illegal action. Give me a response of how, under the new guidelines, we would have resolution based upon an egregious attempt to superset the rules and regulatory state.
So if there was a conflict between our bureaus, for instance, at the regional level, the Interior Regional Director would be charged with pulling people together, defining the nature of the conflict, narrowing it to the extent it could be, clarifying issues that would then be rapidly elevated to the Secretary's office in Washington rather than letting things fester. And we'd identify, I think, problems sooner and get them elevated faster if they couldn't be resolved at the regional level.
End of the day, can't get resolution. How do we look at redirecting or putting somebody in a position for success instead of failure?
One thing we can do is by having the people who are making the decisions closer to the place where the decisions are going to have impact on the ground. And that's part of the rationale for moving BLM and USGS headquarters west. So you'll have more informed headquarters people as opposed to people who are located thousands of miles away and have never been on the ground in Maricopa County, for instance, or St. George, Utah.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary.
Thank you so much. I'll recognize myself again for another 5 minutes. But, the questions that are being brought up naturally all go back to the same basic question, is regarding the document. We've requested it, and you've had 20 days to review the doc. That should be more than enough time. And as you know, the deliberative process, it's not a legally defensible reason to deny Congress this document. And can you provide any type of legal justification whatsoever for withholding the plan?
Sir, for once, I'm glad I'm not an attorney, so I won't dare to go outside of my area of expertise. So I cannot provide that.
Thanks so much. And just back to the general questions again, Mr. Bromwich, any evidence at all that this reorganization strategy or plan is going to strengthen agency decision-making?
Well, if there is, we haven't seen it, and it's up to the agency to provide it. I looked at the reorganization website that DOI sponsors. There's been nothing posted on it since November 1. One of the key elements of a reorganization, if it's going to succeed, is to continue to push information out to all of the stakeholders who are affected by it, most particularly the employees in the agencies that are going to be affected. And you can read through everything that's on the DOI reorganization website in less than half an hour. And as I say, it hasn't been updated in 5 months, since November 1. So you can't handle a reorganization that is a mystery shrouded in another mystery. You need to be open about it. You need to provide the details of what you're doing. You need to lay out the costs and benefits that will be accomplished through the reorganization. None of that has been done. Mr. Cameron has done a very good job of talking in generalities, but they are only generalities. And without having the kind of analysis that undergirds a real and potentially successful reorganization, it's simply not going to work. If the reorganization that has been described by Mr. Cameron and has previously been described by Secretary Sinky were submitted to a board of directors of any major company in this country, it would be rejected flatly for lack of detail.
Thank you. Ms. Rappaport-Clark, with regard to, is there any evidence at all that the reorganization will provide or improve protection for endangered species or other natural resources?
Mr. Chairman, I don't see it, and I'll just echo what Mr. Bromwich just said. It is disturbingly sparse in details, and the coordination at the regional level, the coordination at the field level actually does occur. So sending headquarters people to the west isn't going to enhance interagency coordination and collaboration and resource sharing. It will undermine actually bureau director coordination if half are in the west and half are in the east. And it all, at the end of the day, employees are confused, and important resources like endangered species, water, natural resources, lands, are just a big confused mess. I don't see how it is organized in a way that will allow and support more efficient decision-making or stakeholder engagement.
Thank you so much. And Chairman Fraser, what do you think the Interior could do with the, there's been $60 million spent so far. What do you think the Interior could do with an extra $60 million?
Well, with all the flooding going on, I could think of 2 roads on our reservation that could use it. I think BIA Route 12 and Route 7 could use $60 million. I think we done a engineer report on one, and it was going to be over 30 million. So we could better use that money on our reservations, and I'm sure other tribes throughout can use them too.
No, thanks so much. And with that, I'll yield back my time and now recognize Ranking Member Gohmert for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Fraser, I understood you to say that you didn't recall hearings and whatnot, but I can assure you the committee would be very interested in any suggestions you or other Native Americans would have for suggestions about reorganization. I'm one that doesn't really care if there wasn't a lot of internal proposals, especially from top people at DOI. I think it is a bureaucratic nightmare, and I think the treatment of Native Americans by BIA and others has not been what it should have been. So please consider this is a chance to get information. If DOI is not interested, I know from Chairman Cox, we both, and this committee would be interested in any suggestions you have. So please keep that in mind. And with regard to the reorganization, Mr. Cameron, I know you're aware that in recent years, especially the last administration, but even going before that, the Department of Interior has been plagued with harassment claims. And so I'm wondering what reorganization would do to help address some of these. Well, it's just far too widespread, the reports of workplace harassment.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mr. Gohmert. So both under Secretary Sinky and now Secretary Bernhardt, there is considerable attention being paid on the part of the Department to workplace harassment issues. Totally unacceptable. The department has a no-tolerance policy. When he was Deputy Secretary, Secretary Bernhardt directed all the bureaus to come up with action plans that would deal with the harassment issue, and he held quarterly meetings with those bureaus to track what they were doing. on the harassment plans. I've personally participated in a series of site visits and meetings with employees to communicate the significance of the issue and the need to deal with it. So we're going on all cylinders to try to fix these problems, Mr. Gohmert.
Well, I figure any organization that has the kind of harassment claims that DOI has had needs reassessment and reorganization to try to avoid that. You also need reassignment of individuals. If they can't be fired, when I was in the Army, the threat was also always you're going to end up in Outer Anahuac, the island at the end of the Lucian Change, at just a small listening post. But there's got to be places, if you can't fire them, they need to be reassigned. If they are guilty of any type of harassment, you're not able to fire them. But that ought to be part of any reorganization. And I'd also tell you, with regard to the Park Service, I was absolutely appalled, being the guy that opened the World War II memorial, when barricades had been rented or purchased and put up in an open-air memorial to do nothing but harass the nation's veterans that put their lives on the line. And it was clear, I mean, there were, whether it's Mount Vernon, where federal government only owned the parking lot, they did everything they could to make everybody's life miserable. I was really proud of Iwo Jima veterans when I got over to try to open that memorial for them. The bus of World War II veterans had already just run over and busted up the barricade. They said, we didn't let the enemy keep us from getting to the top of Mount Suribachi, and we weren't going to let a little wooden barricade keep us from the memorial. But those kind of harassment of the public in general, and everybody I talked to at the lowest levels of the Park Service had nothing to do with it. They loved working with people and trying to make things accommodating. But that came from high levels at the Park Service. I was part of a Christian gathering, maybe 200,000. At the last minute, high up in the Park Service, they have one small opening, which forced people to stand in line for hours, and then they tried to close it down early because they didn't have enough water, because they didn't anticipate the last-minute directive by the Park Service. So please keep in mind those kind of things as you look at the reorganization. I appreciate it.
Thank
Yes,
you, Mr.
sir,
Gohmert.
absolutely.
And we'll recognize the gentleman from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron, in the testimony you said in response to the feedback that the agency received from tribes, that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Education, the Office of Special Trustee for American Indians will be left out of the reorganization. I have a letter here from BIA Regional Office telling tribal leaders in my own district that the department is closing an office and consolidating the workload to another office. We also heard from Chairman Fraser about the Great Plains lacking a permanent regional director after the last one was moved around several times. We have the communications from the National Congress of American Indians to Mr. Bernhardt back in December that DOI, quote unquote, has not consulted with tribes regarding the overwhelming internal restructuring of BIA within the last 2 years. Much change has occurred within BIA, none of which was consulted on with tribes. Doesn't sound to me like the tribes are getting their wish of being left out of the reorganization at this point. I've been hearing that that's happening throughout Interior. Mr. Cameron, will you commit to giving this committee a list of programs and offices that have been closed, consolidated, or reduced in staff by more than 30% since January 20th of 2017, so that we can have that information? Since we don't have a plan, at least we know what the unspoken plan is at this point.
and see if we can pull together that information. I would point out that in every administration, going back to 1849, there are always internal changes that are being made. At a micro scale, offices are being opened, offices are being closed, staff or functions are being moved from one place to another. It shouldn't surprise anyone that something could be happening in BIA or BIE over a period of time, but it's unrelated to the broader reorganization activity of the department. I'd also like to point out...
I'll be surprised if we get that information properly, to be honest with you, given the track record here. We don't have a plan. That's in some space that we can't have access to it, even though it's an oversight committee, even though it's our jurisdiction. It seems to be a plan that is full of details after the fact, and even on this request about which was been reduced by 30%, we'll wait and see how the leadership in Interior responds to that. Mr. Bromwich, I was going to ask about reorganization and the issue of how successful it can be or can't be. You pointed out some points. If a reorganization for the purposes of efficiency, better response to the public, better enforcement and appreciation for the legal mandates that an agency might have, if that was a reorganization heading in that direction for efficiency and response, how do you plan for that? Because what we're doing...
You plan for it by identifying what the inefficiencies and problems are. You identify the problems, and then you figure out a way to solve them. You don't announce a global reorganization in response to vague concerns, maybe a small number, maybe a large number of specific concerns, if the reorganization is not designed to address them. That's why you have to have an analysis of what the problems are. And if you are thinking of a reorganization, before you announce it, you do that analysis, you publicize that analysis, you discuss the changes you're considering with the stakeholders, particularly your own employees who are going to be responsible for implementing it, and then you remain flexible in making adjustments to it depending on the analysis that you do and the feedback that you get. What seems to have happened here is people fell in love with a very ambitious reorganization plan without doing the very important, the essential spade work to see what was necessary and how to accomplish it.
Would that fit the definition of a vanity plan?
Would it fit the definition of what?
A vanity plan that you said earlier. That
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. You announce something with a big press release, a big set of statements, and then staff is left to fill in the details.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Mr. Grijalva, that's the way everything is done around here. It's a vanity plan. Stage it and then
I work
let your
out of
staff work the
humility, sir.
details. Humility. Yeah, right. Okay. Mr. Cameron, let's talk about some of that spade work that happens. What does SES mean?
Senior Executive Service.
And did you not have one of the SES, a 2-day conference with those people on this plan?
We did, sir. It was more than a year ago. We brought in all
Did
the
they have
regional...
recommendations?
We spent 2 days chatting with them. They gave us lots of ideas, and we modified our original conception of the plan based on their feedback.
So you have implemented those types of things.
Yes, sir. We're in the process of implementing them.
And as you go and talk to interest groups, whatever they be, you have implemented those changes. The changes from the county lines to the state lines, was that pushed by the states?
It was pushed by the Western Governors Association in particular.
Look, I don't want to actually defend any bureaucracy in Washington, especially because the Department of Interior, let's face it, if you were actually a business, you'd been bankrupt years ago. But you have not just been silent on all these issues. If I'm just looking at this, you already have provided 27,000 pages of documents in response to questions about Secretary Bernhardt's schedule. The committee has received 19,982 pages from the DOA in response to inquiries on the Trump administration's revisions on national monuments. You provide the committee with telephone records of the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement Director, requested by the majority. DOI has provided a response letter to the majority seeking information and documents related to their proposed reforms in a FOIA request. Outstanding committee requests currently being negotiated include scheduling transcripts, interviews with 4 members of Secretary Bernhardt's staff regarding calendars. You have been sending stuff up to us. It's not just a void that happens to be down here. Now, look, I hope, are you planning on a 3rd round? Unfortunately, I have a life outside of this committee, so I'm going to have to leave after this one. I'll apologize for leaving you alone there. But you're dealing with people. If government was producing widgets on an assembly line, you could give some kind of statistical data of what is or is not working. What you're dealing with right now is individuals. And how can you maximize the efficiency of those individuals vis-a-vis the people that they are allegedly supposed to serve? From my personal experiences in dealing in the West, and I live in one of those states that 60% of my state is controlled by you. You are the slumlords of Utah. It is easy to work with the local officials. They live in the community. They know the situations. They usually are the most creative. On almost any time we have a problem, it's as those creations go up the food chain and end up in Washington. That is why we have this significant problem of how do we actually make Washington understand what's happening a 4-hour plane ride away from what is going on? So the question is, can you have good, decent people here in Washington make good, decent decisions? Of course you can. Can you have good, decent people in the localities making good, decent decisions? Of course you can. Can you have rotten officials in both places? Yeah, and we have. The question is, what would give the propensity of a better organization? How can people at some point actually know how they can get to a solution and talk to somebody who's making a decision? Let's face it, I tell my constituents, I have the greatest job in the world. You don't know what I do, and you can't get hold of me. And if you don't like the decisions our agencies do, what are you going to do? Fly back to Washington, throw rocks at the window? It just doesn't happen. If those decisions are going to be made closer to where the people are, the propensity will be those decisions will be more reflective of what their needs are, and there is an opportunity of getting some kind of feedback. It doesn't happen in the status quo. It hasn't happened in decades back here with the status quo. So this vision of what you can happen is something that I certainly hope is going to be pursued, because you're talking about how we can give services to people. Not responding to lawsuits, not responding to special interest groups, but how you can get response back to people and how they can have their input. Now, I would love to ask you some more questions on what you think you can do, like USGS going to Denver. Why you want to be in Denver, I don't know, but USGS going back there, what the possibility would be there. But I've only got 22 seconds. If you can say something in 15 seconds, go for it.
You're absolutely right in your analysis of the situation. And by having people, having decision makers within a 1-hour plane ride instead of a 4-hour plane ride, you're going to have it easier for constituents to get to the decision makers, and you're going to have people who are making the decisions who actually understand what's happening on the ground.
I don't want a 1-hour plane ride. I want to walk around the block to yield back.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Bishop, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. And to continue along that same vein, I'd like to just add that over 90% of Interior employees already work outside the D.C. region. And so certainly, back to what we kind of stated before, is this really a solution in search of a problem? But with regard, to the unified regions, the question is, why 12 regions? And Secretary Sinky envisions having, Interior regional directors, or these IRDs, in charge of each of these 12 regional unified regions. And in your testimony, you said, quote, "We're exploring what the permanent role might be for an individual designated as an Interior regional director," end quote. And you're proposing to stand up an entirely new layer of bureaucracy without knowing what the people working there will do all day or what their authority will be. Would that be a correct statement?
Mr. Chairman, so we're looking at director. The focus would vary from region to region because the issues in California are different from the issues in the Southeast or from the Great Lakes or from the Northeast. So the particular portfolio of an Interior Regional Director would vary based on the needs of the area. California and Texas are very different.
Thanks. In any, can you offer how these IRDs will be selected? Will they be chosen by the Executive Resources Board, which is staffed with political appointees and run by Mr. Bernhardt? Last year, I think the plan was for Mr. Bernhardt to have veto authority over decisions made by their IRB. Or is that still the case?
Well, ultimately, the Secretary of Interior is responsible for virtually every decision at the department. So, you know, the buck ultimately stops in the Secretary's office. If these are members of the Senior Executive Service, which is the current plan, then by definition, they would their selection would be approved by the Executive Resources Board. And it's worth pointing out there are career civil servants on the Executive Resources Board. I'd also like to point out that since President Carter signed the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978, it's been policy that SCSers should be rotating on a fairly regular basis. The OPM target is 15% a year, and that has rarely been realized.
Thanks. And with respect to the plan for Mr. Bernhardt to have veto authority over decisions made by the IRD, will that still be the case?
Well, as secretary, ultimately, he's responsible for all key decisions at the department, as is the case now and has been the case for 150 years. So, yeah, the secretary ultimately has the ability, within the constraints of law, to change decisions that are made lower in the organization.
Thanks so much. And to each of the witnesses, is there anything else you'd like to add? And we can start with Chairman Fraser.
Yeah, thank you. You know, one of the things, and I was just thinking back when we're talking about getting everybody back together, or how it'd be easier for the tribes. This past spring, when we were having flooding, USGS has a measuring station down along the Marl River where I live in the community of Whitehorse, South Dakota. One of the things is they come and they never did talk to us. And finally, one day, we found out they were going down there to collect data because we needed to be prepared for in case there was more flooding going to happen. The only way that they talked to us is I had to send a tribal police officer down to tell him that I was wanting to get a report, what's going on. So even though a lot of these agencies do not communicate, do not consult with tribes, USGS, minerals, it seems like they don't have the experience to know issues of Indian tribes and Indian people. So that's kind of a big issue, and it needs to be resolved, whether this reorganization happens or not. You know, and this is the guy to do it, I guess. So I'm getting, thank you.
Thank you, Chair, sir. Ms. Rappaport Clark.
Thank you. I just have to say, I think this is becoming more confusing. There seems to be some suggestion that decisions only happen in Washington, and there are 70,000 employees at the Interior Department, many of which, as you mentioned, are in the West, and there are qualified refuge managers, park superintendents, state directors of the Bureau of Land Management, all of whom work very closely and collaboratively. Are there conflicts from time to time? Yes. And I agree with Mr. Cameron that the buck does stop with the Secretary of the Interior. But moving and reorganizing to deal with undefined or ill-defined challenges, it seems to me to be really wrong-headed and reckless. And the notion that senior executive service folks are supposed to be moved around might be true based on a President Carter signed memo, but clearly the way that it has been handled by this administration with surprise letters and no consultation, and the consultations that have occurred with the senior executives on this issue are lectures, not conversation. There's a culture of fear now, Mr. Chairman, and folks are not sharing their concerns, their thoughts, their contributions for fear of what will happen when they raise their head and offer opinions. The employees of the department are not in a good place, and this reorganization isn't helping it.
Thank you so much. And with that, we'll recognize the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I want to follow up on the question for the process of relocating headquarters staff and positions west. Mr. Cameron, explain the process for relocating headquarters staff west.
Thank you, Mr. Gohmert. So what we are doing is we're having conversations with the leadership of USGS and BLM on this topic. We're identifying geographic options. USGS seems to be honing in on the Denver metropolitan area. BLM less so. I think there are more places in play. We're having conversations with the General Services Administration about the availability of office space in various locations, about the cost of office rent in various locations. We are BLM in particular, I think, is having conversations with headquarters staff about who might want to move west and who might want to go on a voluntary basis, is sort of dependent upon the selection of a city. So those conversations are being ongoing. Congress appropriated $17.5 million in 19. We only got that money around 2 months ago. So I think it's unreasonable to think that we'd have it all spent and clearly defined by now. Besides, we have an obligation to communicate with the appropriators on what our plans are for spending that money. So those are just some of the things. We have, in terms of benefit cost analysis on the administrative functions, we've gotten a report from one consulting firm on an information technology, a second one on our procurement function, a third one coming out this summer on human resource management. So we think we'll have lots of intellectual fodder to make intelligent decisions to save money on back office functions, so we can have more dollars going to the front line.
Well, what are some of the benefits you've seen from the Bureau of Reclamation moving west?
The vast majority of the headquarters operation for reclamation has been in Denver for quite a few years. To Mr. Bishop's point earlier, it's just a lot easier for constituents to go to Denver from Utah or from Nevada or from Arizona or from Texas than to have to go all the way to Washington, D.C. if they have a problem. Also, the people who are located in Denver are much more familiar with Western issues because they're much more likely to get out on the ground, to Mr. Bishop's point, as well. So we think we've got better decision-making because we've got elements of headquarters outside of Washington in the vicinity of the people who are actually being served by those missions of the department. And we anticipate with BLM and USGS there'll be similar advantages.
Well, I know from confronting people that work for Department of Interior around different places in the country, one of the most common expressions you hear in response to our questions is, that's above my pay grade, I don't know. And so it would be nice to have the people who are making those decisions at their pay grades out there closer to what's happening. You mentioned previously that the Department of Interior commissioned 3 external assessments examining human resources management. And further, that makes a point, USGS is mentioned a number of times in the hearing today. They were always considered the gold standard when it came to any type of measurements. And then we've had hearings in this room where we found out USGS had people that just commonly changed the actual measurements without any manner or means, no explanation for why they were routinely changed from what they factually were. So I can't help but think that if people, whether it's 90% that are out in the field, if they have supervisors that are closer to them, that we'll see better results and less misapplication.
I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Gohmert. Having senior management closer to on-the-ground activity is always going to produce closer supervision, better communications, and we hope, quite frankly, that more decisions will be made by solid regional leaders, career SES leaders, and fewer decisions will be kicked up to Washington where the opportunity to make a mistake is perhaps higher because the decision maker is remote and not as knowledgeable of local issues.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate the chairman having the hearing.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the witnesses again for being here today. Our reorganizations are time-consuming and expensive efforts. As we've heard today, success depends on careful analysis and meaningful consultation with employees, Congress, states, tribes, and local governments and other stakeholders. To date, Interior's reorganization has been done in the dark, without analysis and meaningful consultation. This committee has yet to see any real information. And as a result, the department is failing in its responsibilities to this country's citizens, Native nations, Native peoples. And in failing in these responsibilities to its employees, it's also failing in its responsibility to manage its resources for our nation's future generations. And that's just unacceptable. Secretary Bernhardt has an opportunity to course correct. I hope he takes that opportunity. I'm going to ask unanimous consent to insert the following documents into the record. Defenders of Wildlife letter to Secretary Sinky dated May 29, 2018. Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association Incorporated letter dated August 20th, 2018. The GAO report 18-427, Government Reorganization, Key Questions to Assess Agency Reform Efforts. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you. Thanks for that.